When I was a kid, my version of the X-Men was the cartoon X-Men Evolution. Absolutely loved that show. I even tried to get the Burger King toys that went with it. And I remember some kind of mini computer disc thing. I don't think I ever got it to work. Of course, you have your favorite characters. Love me some Nightcrawler. Pert was the best. Still love the furry blue elf to this day. While the comic version has a little more depth and nuance than this cartoon version, seeing as I don't think this cartoon one had the Catholicism present in its characterization, they nailed the vibe, always willing to help, and a good, kind friend. My other favorite character is a little odd, however, because I loved Toad. Now, this love of the evolution version of the character never really translated to other versions, seeing as the other versions were just kind of gross and sycophantically loyal to Magneto. The cartoon version was a little different. Same powers, but leaning into the gross-out humor of the time. He was sickly and gross, and just not a real pleasant person to be around. I don't know, maybe I just like that not caring attitude. I mean, I liked the character enough to walk around like I thought he did. Of course, that just meant I would hop around and walk on my toes. And you wonder if I'm neurodivergent. Really did love that cartoon. And while those two stuck with me, I don't think I disliked any character. In fact, I think I enjoyed all of them. The stories were the base framework of X-Men stories, and the characters were stripped out versions of the ones from the books. Not that I would have ever known. I did not get the luxury of growing up near a comic shop, and even if I did, family never had the money to throw around there. I was lucky to save up money and maybe get a trade manga volume a year. But I did eventually dive into the comics, realized just how dope Kurt is, and let the evolution version of Toad be my version of Toad. I learned the continuity, the characters, and just what all this could mean. I was older now. The themes present presented themselves to me. A ton has been said about those themes, the ideas of civil rights, gay rights, and others, and just how the X-Men symbolize each of them in turn. But these symbolisms are not without critique. On one hand, it was a useful tool for back in the day, where there might have been pushback on talking about these issues. Marvel Comics have always had some form of political message in their pages. Stan himself stated as such, but metaphors can make an unknowing audience more receptive of the ideas. But the critique I mentioned is not an unfounded one, that the continued reliance on the metaphor can make actual discussion of the issues blurred. Racism might lose its punch by the continued use of this fantastical version of such, or an even more harmful idea, that the creation of new characters being mutants means that could be enough diversity. That you would not need to add racial, LGBTQA, or disabled representation in stories because the metaphor does that for you, allowing for having your cake and eating it too, without doing any of the real work. You can have diversity without rocking the cis patriarchal white supremacist world. There's also a separate critique, that because the X-Men books are where the stories of adversity are, that if you make a new character that is queer, POC, or some form of disabled, that is where you place them, standing the edges off of their real-world identity for a fictional one that could be easier for writers to deal with. Again, trying to avoid the real-world work of showing these type of people off. In some ways, these criticisms are extremely valid, and in the most ungracious way is just sectioning off this little area, saying that people who want representation can go to their little mutant aisle and get their characters. Look, they have a sale on Powerful Black Woman. This time, she has a mohawk. Though I think this is a less deliberate quarantine and more of unfortunate accident. In my charitable view, which, note, is not the only one, the creatives who really got the X-Men over the years knew all this. They knew that the mutant metaphor falls apart somewhat when faced with real-world issues that it resembles. So they added real people to talk about these real issues, while also couching it in the fantastic world of the mutants. Take Northstar, for example. Northstar, for people who are not aware, is the first gay character Marvel ever made. and he was created in the 1980s. And while his sexuality was not revealed in full till much later, he was written as if he was a gay man. And reading those old stories really does show that. His being gay is not couched in mutant stuff, he is just a gay mutant. As time has moved on, older characters that were couched in this framing, say someone like Storm, gets fleshed out away from just being a mutant who is African, even though she was born in America. Comics are goofy. And even then, this commingling of the mutant metaphor can mix beautifully with the real-world things it proposes to represent. Take a big example that has really gotten to the core of my understanding of the characters that I mentioned in brief. Disability. Now, I make no attempt to hide my own disability, which takes its form in neurodivergency. It is a major part of my life, something I relate to others with, and something I keep an eye out with media. Now, with my more adult brain looking at these colorful characters, what do I see? There's Cyclops with a direct fantastical disability of not being able to turn off his power, needing an aid. Rogue and Strong Guy whose powers result in sensitivity to their environment. Or Beak, whose mutation affects his daily life, and while he is currently not considered a mutant by editorial, Quicksilver has had seen where his description of his speed sound an awful lot like ADHD. These fantastical versions of disability are not one-to-one applicable to any one thing. They are related, they are similar, but they are not exact. Meanwhile, in comparison to, say, characters like Daredevil, whose disability is very exact, he's blind. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Sure, he has superpowers, to help alleviate some of the difficulty in his day-to-day life, but he is blind. Mutants have always had this benefit of vagueness. It can go from racial issue to LGBTQ to disability, although that last one hasn't been brought up a ton. I hope it will be more in the future. And that's where people problems come in. It is vague. It is not one-to-one. It is a faulty metaphor for real issues. But to me, that only counts if you're expecting it to be reflective of one-to-one real issues. In recent books, they have been very clear when someone is gay, when someone is a minority, and when someone has a very specific disability and also happens to be a mutant. They are not mutually exclusive, and I think that is where the mutant metaphor is finally coming to its true own. Being a mutant is not being queer, or being a person of color, or being disabled. Being a mutant is forced intersectionality. Okay, I said a big odd word that probably needs a little bit of an explanation. Intersectionality is a concept that basically no one concept of identity is an island unto its own. You are not just a gay person, you are a gay white person. And how those two concepts of self interact also reflect on how you interact with other queer people. Also reflects on how deeply these roles interact with you. A queer person who is able-bodied is probably more likely to be able to live in society than a queer person who is disabled. The two aspects compounding to make contemporary life all the more difficult to live. And in some ways, intersectionality also acknowledges how the systems that oppress some still oppress others, but just not as much. So the gears are probably turning in your head realizing what I'm talking about. Fundamentally, being a mutant is a forced form of intersectionality for all these disparate people. Remove the mutant kind concept. Other than pure empathy, what would Cyclops and Storm have in common to fight for each other? Is there any place where Northstar, a queer Canadian man in the 80s, has any reason to trust Colossus, a simple farm boy from the Soviet Union? Because they are all mutants, they all have an understanding of some common identity that lets them connect to each other and build off of, and learn more about other things that make them who they are. It kickstarts the empathy of understanding between each other. This was never the intent of Stan, Jack, or even Claremont. It is, I think, a happy accident that the collective writers have genuinely tapped, but I do think they are getting to a point of intersectionality. The continued acknowledgement of Iceman's current gayness in combination with the history of X-Men in queer politics said something. The continued exploration of just what it means for Magneto to be both Jewish and a mutant. There is something to the fact that mutant kind is seemingly pushed to the outskirts when in all seriousness, they would be in a much better place if they worked in solidarity with other members of the superhero community. In fact, we see this exact thing take place at the end of Krakoa. For a while, mutant kind was a way to have the sharp edges of the human experience that should be explored be rounded down to a comfortable fantasy of heroics. Now it seems much more that mutant kind is a foundation, the bottom layer of which all these characters can interact and relate to on a base level, so that those sharp edges of humanity can be all the sharper. It allows for greater empathy of characters coming together under a like-minded banner and embracing those differences. But it can also cause greater rifts, that these sharp edges of humanity can push these people who have so much in common apart. There's also the benefit of editorially, for a while, mutant characters often get wrapped up and lost in the X-Men sauce. However, with this intersectional mindset with mutant powers, it becomes a less significant thing that they are mutant and can have the opportunity to spread their wings beyond the X-Men. It is a base layer to characters, so the other more reflective real-life human element can shine all the brighter. But in the same way that both the Fantastic Four and the Spider-Man are both powered individuals. But what makes Peter Parker is his poor luck, a working class background, while the Fantastic Four have near infinite resources. However, I can see an unintended side effect that if the writers are unwilling to tackle these concepts, that would just make mutant characters all the more samey. No, I don't think they're going down that route, and from everything I've read recently, it feels like the writers are, well, maybe not consciously seeing what I'm putting down on the table, but subconsciously are, and picking it up. An example of such being the self-classism that Rogue is inflicting on herself, and the immediate response of her fellow mutants. Over-analyzing simple, basic character empathy, probably to this extent, is mostly just a way for me to talk about the X-Men for a while. Most definitely. But I think there's something here. All too often, the mutants are treated as outcasts to the rest of the Marvel Universe. And people make fun of that, pointing out that being prejudiced against a mutant makes no sense if the Fantastic Four are right there and everybody loves them. But fundamentally, these differences don't matter. The fact that it happens is a primary aspect of mutant kind. People irrationally hate the mutants for the same reason people irrationally hate people of color, or queer folk, or the disabled. It doesn't make sense in the real world, so why would it make sense in the fictional? All these characters have that common connection to mutant kind, just like we all have that connection of being human. Listen to others, be better, and do what Scott Summers would do.